Do I regret getting the DRZ400E? Well, the short answer is no, but the long answer is it's quite complicated. That's why I'm making this video. So let's roll that intro and let me explain. So I've been getting a lot of questions about how I'm finding the DRZ400. So if I'm being honest, this isn't a match made in heaven. This is more of a marriage of convenience. I needed the DRZ behind me for two major reasons. One was I needed an off-road bike to continue making content and continue my off-road journey, as I really need to capitalize on those moments when I have free time and I'm healthy enough to get off in the dirt, and I don't want to miss that opportunity. And for that, I'm very thankful that the DRZ has been able to help me get back off-road. But I also bought it because there were really no other options that I wanted at that time. You've got to remember the CRF300L wasn't for sale yet. We're not getting the KLX300, but I was waiting to find out if we were. It was also very hard to find any KLX 250Ss to put a big bulk kit in because the market was so crazy hot. There were no WR 250Rs for sale, and the one that I did nail down got sold under my feet. So there were a lot of circumstances that led up to me purchasing this bike. So let's talk about what I've liked so far. I absolutely love the looks of this bike. This yellow and black tank with this particular decal looks absolutely fantastic on this bike. Set off with the black rims, I think it looks fantastic considering this is a 20-year-old design for a motorcycle. It looks fairly fresh. The other thing I love is how easy it is to get accessories for this bike and just how many are available. With the right amount of money, you really can turn this bike into whatever you want. And I want you to pay attention to that statement because that's the linchpin here. I wanted this bike to be a fairly budget bike. I didn't want to sink too much money into it, and that's where my problem is starting to creep up, but we'll get more into that in a little bit. In the dirt, this is fantastic. There's no question that this bike was designed and born to ride off-road. It's very composed, it's confidence inspiring, considering that I've had 3 years off from riding the dirt. And it's also very torquey for a 400cc, so that's something nice as well. It's very hard to stall, even if you're a muppet with the clutch off-road and you're finding it hard, you really can tractor along. So there's a lot to like about this DRZ, and I really did want to highlight how capable this is off-road. The suspension, despite being outdated, is still very competent. It will get flustered as you pick up the pace and the harder the riding you do, but it certainly is competent enough to be happy with for the first, I'd say, 6 months of ownership if you're not riding it hard. So those are some great aspects to this bike. The other fantastic thing about this bike is how much knowledge and the community. The DRZ guys that love these bikes and own these bikes and live and breathe DRZ are fantastic. They always offering their knowledge and help. I found them fantastic on the forums. There's so many videos and how-tos on this bike that working on this bike has been a dream and something that I've really appreciated. I've had a few bikes lately that I've absolutely botched my efforts to work on, namely the Harley that I used to own, and it really ruined my confidence as to working on my own motorcycle. And this bike has brought back that love of tinkering on the bike for myself, and for that I'll be eternally thankful for this DRZ. I bought this bike mainly because it was the last DRZ in Western Australia, and they're also offering it with a Cape York pack. So what's the Cape York pack? Well, it comes with Pro Taper handlebars, which I absolutely love. I always have Pro Tapers. I've got some 35mm risers, although I have had to take them off because the cables just aren't long enough to cope with it, so that's a bit annoying. I've got the good old Barkbusters, the Australian made bulletproof handguards there. They've been great. I've also got some Suzuki radiator guards, a Suzuki bash plate, but other than that, it's pretty bog standards. I have put a 15-tooth front sprocket on. You might ask me why I haven't put a 44th tooth on the back as well to make the riding on the highway a little better. Again, it's one of those things, I just don't want to sink that extra money in at the moment. With the 15 tooth on the front, it can handle 100 kilometers without exploding the engine. So Most of the riding, I just try and stay to back roads to get to the dirt at the moment. So that at the moment is good enough. But if I'm thinking about getting this long term, or you're thinking about having this long term, I would encourage you to put that 44 tooth on the rear if you're doing a lot of road work, because it is a chore of a thing to ride on the road in the DRZ400E. So that's 1447 from stock. So it's very different from the American S model that you have. And I wanted to point that out as well in the discussion. The S that you get in America is heavier. It has a different carburetor. So this has the FCR pumper carb straight from the factory in Australia. It also has the open air box. It's much lighter than the S, and it also has a different subframe setup. So it's a much different subframe. So there are a few different key features on the S model. So keep that in mind, that this makes more power and it's much lighter and it's much less competent on the road than the S is. So keep that in the back of your head when I'm talking about this bike. So what's the reason for me not really getting along with this bike? Well, the main reason is I didn't want to sink too much money into this. I was really hoping that with a few choice mods that I could get this bike to where I needed it to be. And perhaps that's ignorance on my part for not doing my research enough, but I was hoping that with this basic modifications that it would really suit me and get me to where I need to be. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. So the first surprising thing is just all the tiny niggles that you need to fix with the DRZ. Now, the breather hoses need to be addressed. They're very low down on the bike. They pop out just behind the bash plate down here. So if you go through any kind of water crossing that's deeper than basically the bash plate, you will likely stall out because you starve oxygen from the carburetor. So you need to reroute a couple of those hoses. No big problem. I quite enjoyed the time in the garage rerouting the hoses and fixing that up. But the second issue I've got is the clutch on this, because you need to have the clutch in every time you start the bike. Now that might not seem like the major annoyance, and certainly not a reason for me to be so frustrated with the bike, but it's just one more little thing. I like to be able to start my bike without having to pull the clutch in every time, particularly if you're getting on and off the bike, or if you're off camber, off road, and you can't quite reach the clutch. It can get just a little bit annoying. So that just added a little bit of annoyance. Another frustration is the standing position when doing slightly higher speeds. Now, when you're in the attack position on this bike off-road, it's quite good. But when you're standing up and you're on a high-speed dirt road, the pegs on this bike, where the handlebars are sitting, even with the risers and these taller Pro Taper bars, I just can't get my body weight to where I need it to be to kind of hold myself against the wind buffeting and really feel comfortable. So that is another niggle as well. Another major thing that is Australia specific is when they sell you the E, they take the baffle out of the exhaust. And they do this without asking, and unfortunately the loudness of this bike is just crazy. I am a massive petrol head. You guys know that I love motorcycles, but too loud is just too loud in my eyes, and I don't like obnoxious, embarrassing loudness. And that's what this bike is. I'm embarrassed to start it up in the garage in the morning when I go on my dirt rides. I've had to upgrade my earplugs because it gives me headaches and ringing ears so bad. It really is a frustration. So the fix for that is basically some kind of end cap to reduce the noise a bit, or forking out the massive amount of money for an exhaust that is on a huge wait list because of the health crisis. So that has been a major frustration, is the loudness of this bike. A little annoyance as well is the carburetor. I really appreciate how smooth the carburetor is. You just can't compare how great this bike performs to an EFI bike at low speed. The carburetor on this FCR is fantastic. It's jetted perfectly for where I live, and I really have no complaints there. But it is the warm-up process that gets me annoyed. I often like to hop on my bike on a quick run to the shops. My time is precious to me, so I like to just be able to throw my gear on, hit the start button, put up the garage door and take off. With this DRZ, I need to warm it up for a good couple of minutes, so that's really caught me off guard, and it's really slowed me down and added a little bit of time, which compounds during the day. So that's kind of held me back a little bit. It's kind of cut itself out of a little bit of my life because one, it's so loud, it's embarrassing to ride, and two, that little warm-up process just doesn't really lend itself to a quick ride down to the shops, which is a big part of my motorcycle riding habits. The other thing is the gearing. I was really hoping I could get past the short ratio 5-speed gearbox. And I suspect with the 44 tooth sprocket, I could probably live with it, but I still wouldn't be happy. Now I know there's the ACT gearbox out there, but that's roughly $1,000. And that's a lot of money to sink into a bike you're not really wanting to sink any money into. I know now that I'm a 6-gear kind of guy. Most of my bikes have been 6 gears, and the ones that haven't have had really wide ratio gearboxes for on-road riding. And even then, I've never quite been happy with that fact. I know there's a lot of people out there that'll be throwing rocks at me and saying, you don't need 6 gears, that's a silly reason not to like a bike. But I'm just being honest with you guys, that's how I find it and that's my experience. And I just like 6 gears, I just think it's better at adapting to both scenarios. You've got that 6-gear overdrive for the highway and you've got that extra gear, so you've got 5 gears to work with close ratio for that off-road experience. And I think that's just a far better way of doing it, in my opinion. The other annoyance that I want to chalk up on the list is the fact that this bike doesn't have a fan on the radiators. Now, I know that is model specific, as the S and the SM models that you get in America come with a fan, but the fact that this DRZ is in Australia and doesn't have fans on the radiator is just crazy to me. This bike needs fans on the radiator if you're planning to ride in fairly hot weather. Now, some guys it might be fine, you might be able to ride quick enough to keep the air moving through wherever your riding scenarios. But I find myself in single track quite a lot, and sometimes you just can't ride quick enough to get airflow over the radiators. So I foresee this thing will probably overheat pretty quickly. That is a concern to me, particularly in our hot Australian summers. I live in Western Australia, which is one of the far hotter regions in Australia, so it's definitely going to be an issue. And something I wanted to point out on the Z, particularly here in Australia, I'm not sure how it is in other countries, is the steering lock. So you can see here, the steering lock's just here. So it's separate to the key. Now this isn't out of the ordinary. A lot of cruisers have this feature, particularly old ones. So it's something familiar that I've had on other bikes, but I've never enjoyed having it. And particularly on a bike like this where you're getting on and off it an awful lot, I don't want to have to hop off the bike, then lock the steering as well before I walk off. Now, you might think that, well, that's not a big encumbrance, but you got to think about what I'm using this bike for. I've got cameras to take off the bike, GPS to take off the bike. I also need to remove my tank bag because it's got all my cameras and accessories that I don't bolt onto the bike. So I have a lot of expensive stuff that I'm always having to take on and off to the bike. So I need a bike that is very smooth and low maintenance, getting on and off the bike, and not to have a lot of little niggles to think about. So that's just one extra thing that doesn't help streamline my experience of riding this motorcycle. And that's what I'm about a lot with my bike, because there's a lot of tiny little things to think about when you're trying to make videos, and just adding one more thing to those problems can get a little bit cumbersome. So a few people have really been confused about how often I move through my motorcycles, as lately I've had a bike roughly every 6 months since 2019. So that's a lot of bikes to go through. But it's just how I approach the bikes. One, you've got to remember, I'm a person who makes a YouTube channel, so I need different bikes for different kinds of content. So that's one justification. The other is I just like trying out new things with motorcycles. I don't want to be one of those people that buys one bike and that's it. They never experience all the different flavors of motorcycles and have all those different experiences. I really enjoy getting a bike and finding out what it's all about. That's part of the journey. So I certainly don't regret getting this bike. It's been fantastic to really get to know the DRZ, what it's about and what it's capable of. And for that, I've really enjoyed that side of it. It's just coming from someone that does ride a lot of bikes, you develop this sixth sense of what you really like and what you don't. So when I hop on a bike, it's a little hard to tell just from riding a bike once or twice, but I can pretty much tell you whether this bike is going to be a long-term bike for me after say 200 or 300 kilometers. Once that's under my belt, I pretty much know whether it's the bike for me or not. And if I'm being honest, I already know the answer to that with the DRZ, and it's not really the bike for me. It's got some great aspects of it. I think with some heavy modification, I could probably get it close to what I want. But the reality is there's just better options out there for me. So where to from here? Well, I've already got my eyes on another motorcycle that looks to fit most of my needs, and I gotta say, I'm pretty excited about it. But that's a different conversation and a whole new video. So until next time, I've been Solid. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.